Welcome to this presentation on executive functioning and refusal of Care Act 2014 assessments produced by the Sutton Safeguarding Adults Board. This presentation will cover duties under the Care Act 2014, how and when to act without a person's consent, mental capacity, executive functioning and executive capacity, and also other relevant legislation. Now, I'm sure that you're aware that Section 9 of the Care Act 2014 sets out the circumstances in which a local authority must make an assessment of an adult's needs. And these are that someone appears to have needs for care and support. And if so, then local authorities must assess whether the adult actually does have the need for care and support, and also what those needs might be. I'm also sure that you are aware that Section 11 of the Care Act deals with consent. And it's quite clear that where an adult refuses an assessment of their needs, then the local authority does not have to carry out that assessment. But it's not as simple as that. Section 11.2a of the Care Act states that a local authority must make the assessment if the adult lacks the mental capacity to refuse. And Section 11.2b is clear that if an adult is experiencing or is at risk of abuse or neglect, then the local authority must still make the assessment even without consent. So how might you go about making an assessment without someone's consent? Well, you need to make as complete an assessment as you can and write it down. And this applies, of course, whether or not a person is consenting. However, if they do not consent and do not take part in the assessment, then you need to make what is called a proportionate assessment. And during this, you have to gather information from people who know them. And what does proportionate mean in this context? Well, it means that your assessment is as unintrusive as possible, given the apparent level of risk. And whilst you may have to use information from other people, don't rely on it completely. Use your own observations, any evidence you can gather, and also consider the person's history and what that might tell you about them. I've put together a suggested checklist for a proportionate assessment. And when making the assessment, ask yourself and record your decisions about: what information do I have about the person? Do I need more? Is there someone else who can assist? For example, a friend, a neighbour, or another professional? Have I contacted other agencies for information, to share my concerns and also to inform my professional judgment? Am I satisfied that the person's needs for care and support are being met? And if not, how might they be met? And who might meet them? Does the local self-neglect protocol apply? And is there anything else that I can reasonably do? Have I assessed the risk as best I can in the circumstances? And am I satisfied that the person's support network or other agencies involved have plans in place to continue to minimise and manage risks? If you can answer all these questions satisfactorily, then you will have completed a proportionate assessment. And if a person lacks the mental capacity to refuse the Care Act assessment, then you should include their views, wishes and ambitions in the assessment, use best interest decision-making processes to make decisions on their behalf, and remember that mental capacity is decision and time specific. Just because the person lacks the mental capacity to make one decision doesn't mean they lack the mental capacity to make all decisions. And when should you act without a person's consent? Well, there are a number of situations where you would be expected to act without consent. And these include, for example, if the person lacks the mental capacity to decide what to do in relation to the abuse they are experiencing, if they are in danger, if other people are in danger, if a criminal offence has or may have been committed, and if a child is being affected. And if the person is assessed to have the mental capacity to be able to refuse the character assessment, then consider if they are experiencing coercive control. This can include explicit or implied threats, emotional blackmail, belittling or humiliation. Are they under undue influence? Are they being pressurized by someone? Do they fear the loss of close relationships or getting other people into trouble if they get you involved in their life? Are they scared of the repercussions from those people who might be responsible for abusing them? Are they fearful of the consequences of loss of control of their lives, of having to move into a care setting? Or do they have problems with their executive functioning and their executive capacity? All these factors can limit a person's ability to make decisions and put them into practice. And before we go further, it's worthwhile recapping the stages of the test of mental capacity. And make sure that you assess capacity in this order, because this is consistent with the wording in the Act itself, rather than with the order erroneously set out in the Code of Practice. Firstly, is the person unable to make the decision? And that means that they are not able to do at least one of the following things. That is, to understand information about the decision to be made, to retain that information in their mind, to use or weigh that information as part of the decision-making process, or that they communicate their decision in whatever way is appropriate. Remember that the person needs to do all four of these things. Being able to do three of them, but not the fourth, still means the person cannot make the decision. And the next stage is, if that is the case, does the person have an impairment of or a disturbance in the functioning of their mind or brain? And this can be caused by a condition, an illness, or external factors such as alcohol or drug use. And then finally, is the reason why the person can't make the decision because of that impairment or disturbance in their mind or brain? There may be many reasons why a person can't make a decision, but they only lack mental capacity if the reason they can't make the decision is because of the impairment or disturbance in the functioning of their mind or brain. And remember that people can lack capacity to make some decisions, but still have the capacity to make others. So it's vital to consider whether the individual lacks capacity to make a specific decision. You will also be familiar with the principles of the Mental Capacity Act 2005. However, two of these principles prove especially problematic in practice. And these are Principle 1, the presumption of capacity to make decisions unless proved otherwise. And the problem here is, when would you ever assess a person's mental capacity? And the key thing to do is to keep the person's capacity under review and to identify situations when they appear to put themselves at risk of harm. And the other problematic principle is the third one. Just because a person makes an unwise decision, it does not mean that they lack mental capacity. However, if they keep on making unwise decisions, or if the decisions that they make are harmful, then think, does this mean that the person actually is unable to make the relevant decisions? And if so, should I now consider if their capacity should be assessed? Remember that the Mental Capacity Act does not give people the right to make unwise decisions. And what about executive functioning and executive capacity? What do they mean? Well, executive functioning refers to the cognitive processing and brain functions that we associate with rational decision-making, proportionality, intentionality, and goal-directed behaviours, and also impulse control. And executive capacity refers to a person's ability to turn their decisions into actions. Now, executive functioning and executive capacity are different, but problems with executive functioning can affect a person's executive capacity. I'll illustrate executive capacity by asking you a question as follows. There are 5 frogs sitting on a log. One frog decides to jump off. How many frogs are sitting on the log? The answer is 5. Why? Because making a decision is not the same as putting it into action. And similarly, people who may be able to make a decision may be able to put that decision into practice. And so you may be able to see the challenge that executive functioning and executive capacity presents when you're assessing mental capacity. Because a person's verbal ability is unlikely to be affected, so they can convince you that they're able to make a decision. And this means that their mental capacity assessments may not spot problems. And also the person's ability to control, adapt or moderate their actions may be affected, but you'll need to make longitudinal assessments over time to identify this. Now, there are a number of conditions or life experiences that might indicate problems with executive functioning, which might suggest problems with executive capacity. And these include, although this list is not exhaustive, Korsakoff-Wernicke syndrome, long-term alcohol use, head injuries, emotionally unstable personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, frontal lobe syndrome, fetal alcohol syndrome, and also life trauma. Now, I'm going to talk to you about a man named Lazarus and the Sutton Safeguarding Adult Review, which was published in 2025. Lazarus was a 69-year-old man who had worked as an electrician. Lazarus was described as having a really good sense of humour, and he was also a very talented potter. And Lazarus had a brother who contacted him regularly and saw him every 6 months. Lazarus was married and had a daughter. However, Lazarus's marriage broke down, and as a result of this, he could no longer see his daughter. And in 2015, sadly, Lazarus's daughter died. Lazarus became depressed and started to use alcohol. Lazarus's estranged wife also died. And Lazarus struggled to maintain his home and to manage his health needs, which also included diabetes. And Lazarus told his brother that he'd never talk to him again if he made any agencies aware of Lazarus's circumstances. Lazarus didn't want his brother to be burdened or told about his condition. And in April 2023, the London Fire Brigade raised a safeguarding concern about Lazarus hoarding and self-neglecting. They fitted smoke alarms, but no additional actions were taken under adult safeguarding. And in May 2023, Lazarus was visited by district nurses and by social workers. A blitz clean was completed, but soon after, Lazarus began to decline help. More safeguarding concerns were raised that Lazarus was self-neglecting. A multidisciplinary team meeting in January 2024 identified multiple risks for Lazarus, including malnutrition, neglect, home safety, and falls. But in February 2024, Lazarus's brother telephoned Lazarus but did not receive a reply. Lazarus's brother told the police, who found Lazarus deceased in his home. So what might we learn from Lazarus and other safeguarding adult reviews? Well, there's a need to consider a person's mental capacity to make decisions about their health needs and their care and support needs when they are not meeting these themselves and they are declining offers of support. Consider their functional capacity. Remember to be curious. Just because someone is convincing doesn't mean that they are able. And don't assume that a person's actions are their personal choice. Substance use is often associated with self-neglect, and it's important to suspect and investigate its presence, even if there is no immediate evidence. Similarly, do not underestimate the extent of a person's alcohol consumption. or believe that all of their problems are due to their alcohol consumption. There may be underlying factors. And work with the person's friends and family. They may help you with engagement or may give you information that might help you to find a way to engage with the person. And consider non-engagement as a predictable risk factor in self-neglect. Recognize it as a warning sign that indicates the need, perhaps, for more assertive multi-agency interventions, and certainly to close attention to the person's mental capacity. And there's also another piece of legislation for you to consider, and that's the Human Rights Act 1998. Sometimes you may be unsure how to act. It may not be clear if someone has the mental capacity to make relevant decisions, and you may be uncertain about whether or not to intervene. And remember, in these situations, the Human Rights Act may be a useful guide, because the Act gives you duties under the European Convention on Human Rights, and some of these are really relevant to safeguarding and include Article 2, the duty to protect life; Article 3, the duty to protect against torture, inhuman or degrading treatment; Article 5, the duty to protect against unlawful interferences with liberty, including by private individuals; and Article 8, the duty to protect the person's right to live a private and family life. And it can be helpful to reduce some of the complexity of situations involving self-neglect to these fundamental duties. You have, for example, under Article 2, a duty to protect a person's life. Under Article 8, however, you have a duty to, in effect, protect their way of life. Sometimes these duties are going to be in conflict. You may have to choose between them and decide which one is most relevant to each individual situation. You might, for example, decide that after trying all other approaches, after assessing mental capacity, after seeking guidance from the Court of Protection, after mental health assessments, etc., that the person you are trying to support really does want to carry on as they are, even if the inevitable consequence of this may be that they die. And in this case, you might try approaches that reduce pain and discomfort, maintain the person's dignity, and which respond quickly if the person changes their mind. On the other hand, you may decide that your duty is to protect their life and to temporarily act without their consent, using whatever laws and powers are applicable, so that the person stays alive in order to be able to have a way of life. Always make these sorts of decisions as part of a multi-agency process rather than on your own, and make sure you record the reasoning for your decision. And so, in summary, if someone refuses a Care Act assessment, ask yourself, do they have the mental capacity to refuse? Are they experiencing abuse or neglect? Is their refusal due to outside influence, coercion, control, or fear? Do I have to act to protect their life or the lives of others? And are there concerns about their executive functioning or their executive capacity?